The summer of 1975 carried with it an unsettling tension in America. The post-Vietnam years were already marked by disillusionment, and the Watergate scandal had left the country distrustful of those in power. But in Detroit, Michigan, another storm was brewing, one that combined labor unions, organized crime, politics, and the disappearance of a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in the United States. His name was Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was not just a labor leader. To millions of working-class Americans, he was a symbol of hope. He fought for truck drivers, warehouse workers, and countless others who felt invisible in the face of corporate power. Hoffa had taken the Teamsters Union and transformed it into the most influential labor organization in the country. At its height, the union commanded over 2 million members and billions of dollars in its pension fund. That kind of money and influence inevitably attracted attention, from politicians, from corporations, and, dangerously, from the mob. To his supporters, Hoffa was a fighter who never backed down, a man who truly represented the working class. To his enemies, he was a power-hungry manipulator, too close to organized crime, too willing to bend the rules if it meant getting what he wanted. By the mid-1970s, Hoffa was a man torn between worlds. The loyal union leader who wanted to reclaim his throne, and the aging power broker trapped in a web of dangerous alliances. The story of his disappearance begins on July 30, 1975. Hoffa had arranged to meet two men at the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburb north of Detroit. The meeting was supposed to settle a dispute about his future in the Teamsters Union. Hoffa believed he was on the verge of regaining leadership, but others, particularly those tied to organized crime, were not so eager to see him back in power. That afternoon, Hoffa arrived at the Red Fox around 2 p.m. He waited in the parking lot, growing impatient. He called his wife, Josephine, from a nearby payphone, irritated that the men he was supposed to meet hadn't shown up. To her, his voice carried both confidence and annoyance. He was not a man who liked to be kept waiting. Witnesses later recalled seeing him pacing near his car, a green Pontiac Grandville, glancing at his watch and scanning the lot. Then suddenly he was gone. By the evening, Josephine became worried. Hoffa was not the kind of man who simply disappeared. She tried to reach him, but hours passed with no word. His friends and allies began making calls. The next morning, his car was discovered still parked outside the restaurant, locked and undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no clear indication of what had happened. Hoffa had seemingly vanished into thin air. The news spread quickly. Within days, the disappearance was front-page material across the nation. How could a man of Hoffa's stature, someone constantly surrounded by controversy, protection, and scrutiny, simply disappear without a trace? The mystery fascinated the public and terrified those who knew how dangerous the forces around him could be. For law enforcement, the case was immediately daunting. Hoffa's life had been deeply entangled with organized crime figures, corrupt union officials, and high-powered politicians. Investigators had no shortage of suspects but very little concrete evidence. The FBI was thrust into the center of the investigation, treating the case as one of the most significant missing persons mysteries in American history. As the days turned into weeks, speculation mounted. Some believed Hoffa had been betrayed by his closest allies in the Union, men who feared his return to power would disrupt their control. Others pointed to mob leaders, who allegedly saw Hoffa as a liability. Still others whispered about government conspiracies, suggesting that powerful figures wanted him silenced before he could expose their secrets. The atmosphere in Detroit shifted. Ordinary citizens followed every headline, every rumor, every press conference. Talk radio buzzed with theories. Newspapers ran dramatic spreads on Hoffa's disappearance. For many Americans, it wasn't just the vanishing of one man. It was the vanishing of certainty, the shattering of the idea that powerful people were untouchable. Yet amid the noise, one fact remained clear. Jimmy Hoffa, one of the most famous men in America, had walked into a restaurant parking lot and was never seen again. That was the beginning of a mystery that would span decades. A story of ambition, betrayal, and silence. A story in which nearly everyone involved had something to gain by keeping secrets. And so the search for answers began. The day after Jimmy Hoffa vanished, the first signs of alarm grew louder. His family, particularly his wife Josephine, knew something was terribly wrong. Hoffa was many things: stubborn, ambitious, sometimes reckless, but he was not careless. He did not miss appointments, he did not vanish without a word, and he never ignored his family's calls. For Josephine, the silence was deafening. When Hoffa's car was found in the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox, locked and in perfect order, investigators immediately understood they were dealing with more than a man gone missing. This wasn't a simple case of someone taking off or getting lost. It was something far more complex, something carefully orchestrated. The Bloomfield Township Police took the first reports, but the case quickly escalated to the FBI. Hoffa's prominence, his history with organized crime, and the potential national implications of his disappearance demanded federal attention. Agents descended on the scene, photographing the car, interviewing restaurant employees, and canvassing the area for witnesses. But nothing obvious stood out. The Pontiac held no fingerprints other than Hoffa's own. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no personal belongings left behind. It was as if he had stepped into the ether. In the hours following his disappearance, Hoffa's last known communications became critical. The phone call to Josephine was recorded in her memory with haunting clarity. She remembered his impatience, his irritation at being stood up. That detail became important, because Hoffa had told her exactly who he was waiting for. According to Hoffa, the meeting was supposed to involve Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit mobster known for his violent reputation, and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a Teamsters leader from New Jersey with deep mob ties. Both men had complicated histories with Hoffa. Giacalone had long-standing business dealings with him, while Provenzano had once been Hoffa's ally, only to become a bitter enemy after a prison quarrel years earlier. The idea that Hoffa would agree to meet with these two men together was striking. To some, it suggested arrogance. To others, desperation. Hoffa wanted his power back, and he believed he could negotiate with men who had the influence to decide his fate. But those same men may have seen Hoffa's return as a threat. As news spread that Hoffa had been last seen waiting for mob-connected figures, the case took on a dangerous aura. Reporters swarmed Detroit, eager to capture the unfolding drama. Camera crews camped outside Hoffa's home, chasing family members for comment. His children and grandchildren were thrust unwillingly into the spotlight, their grief and confusion on display for the nation. But the story wasn't just about a missing man. It was about what Hoffa represented. To some, he was a hero of the working class. To others, he was a symbol of corruption. His disappearance created a frenzy because it blurred the line between those two images. People debated in bars, in union halls, in living rooms across America. Was Hoffa a victim, or was he finally paying the price for his dangerous associations? The FBI began building its timeline. Witnesses at the Machus Red Fox recalled seeing Hoffa pacing near his car, looking agitated. Some claimed to have seen a maroon-colored Mercury Marquis pulling into the lot around the time Hoffa disappeared. Others remembered a man leaning against the wall, smoking, watching Hoffa. Yet no one could provide a definitive answer about what happened in those crucial minutes. Investigators also tracked Hoffa's movements earlier in the day. He had visited his friend Louis Linteau, a former Teamster, before driving to the restaurant. Linteau later said Hoffa seemed confident about the meeting, even optimistic that it might resolve ongoing tensions. That detail haunted investigators. Why would Hoffa walk into such a meeting if he feared betrayal? Unless, of course, he believed his presence was protected by trust, or by his own reputation. Within days, the FBI was conducting raids and interrogations. Giacalone and Provenzano were both questioned. Both denied any involvement and insisted they had never agreed to meet Hoffa that day. Each pointed the finger elsewhere, dismissing the disappearance as someone else's plot. Yet to investigators, the denials rang hollow. Still, without physical evidence, the investigation stalled. Hoffa's disappearance became the kind of mystery that seemed unsolvable. There was no body, no weapon, no clear trail, only a swirl of conflicting testimonies and endless speculation. Meanwhile, the media turned Hoffa's story into a national obsession. Magazines ran cover stories with his picture, often framed in stark black and white tones. News anchors spoke his name with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Late-night comedians joked about him being buried in unlikely places, a stadium, a bridge, even under the White House lawn. The speculation became part of American culture, reflecting both fascination and unease. But beneath the headlines, the human toll was profound. Hoffa's family was left in limbo, neither able to grieve fully nor to hope for his safe return. His wife clung to the belief that he was still alive, perhaps being held somewhere, waiting to be released. His children wrestled with the shadow of their father's public life, now overshadowed by mystery. Union members, too, felt the shock. Some feared that Hoffa's disappearance signaled a new era of mob dominance within the Teamsters, an era where dissent would be silenced. Others quietly admitted that Hoffa had made powerful enemies and that his boldness might have led him into a trap he could not escape. By the end of the summer, the FBI had combed through leads in Detroit, New Jersey, and beyond. Informants whispered about meetings, threats, and secret deals, but every thread unraveled into uncertainty. Without Hoffa's body, the case was maddeningly difficult to prosecute. Law enforcement was left with shadows and whispers, unable to turn rumor into evidence. The early days of the search ended with more questions than answers. How could a man so well known, so watched, simply vanish? Was this the work of the mob silencing him forever? Was it a betrayal from within his own circle? Or was there a darker, more hidden conspiracy at play? One involving government interests, unions, and power struggles that reached far beyond Detroit. One thing was certain. The mystery had only just begun. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a national enigma, one that would haunt investigators, journalists, and the American public for decades to come. The summer heat lingered over Detroit, but the atmosphere was cold with suspicion and unease. By now, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just a local story. It had exploded into a national obsession. Every newspaper across America carried his name, every nightly newscast covered the story, and every coffee shop conversation buzzed with theories. Hoffa's disappearance wasn't just about one man. It was about what he symbolized. To many Americans, Hoffa embodied the promise of working-class power. He had fought for better wages and conditions, and for years he had been the voice of men who drove the trucks, loaded the warehouses, and built the nation's economy from the ground up. His sudden vanishing felt like an attack not only on him but also on the labor movement itself. At the same time, Hoffa's reputation was complicated. His ties to organized crime had been widely reported for years. Court cases, prison time, and political battles had left stains on his public image. To some, his disappearance was not surprising. It was the inevitable result of years spent navigating dangerous alliances. For others, it was proof of a system too corrupt to protect those who dared to wield power. The media seized on these contradictions. Headlines alternated between portraying Hoffa as a victim and as a man who had finally met his fate. Television reporters framed their segments with dramatic music and stark language. "Where is Jimmy Hoffa?" became a question not just for investigators but for the entire country. This intense coverage had a ripple effect. For the public, it blurred the line between fact and speculation. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed to have seen Hoffa alive, boarding a plane in Canada or being smuggled into South America. Others whispered that his body had already been buried somewhere in Detroit, under a construction site, a highway, or even inside the foundation of a stadium. Each rumor fed the mystery, keeping the story alive long after the initial search had stalled. The FBI, meanwhile, was under immense pressure. Agents worked around the clock, but every press conference ended with the same frustrating announcement. No leads, no evidence, no answers. The Bureau's credibility was on the line. How could the most famous missing person in America vanish under their watch without a trace? Community fear deepened. In Detroit, where mob influence was no secret, Hoffa's disappearance felt like a warning. If a man as powerful as Hoffa could be silenced, what did that mean for ordinary people? Some union members spoke openly of intimidation. Others grew cautious, lowering their voices when discussing the case, as if they feared unseen ears were always listening. Union halls, once buzzing with political debates and plans for future strikes, became hushed. The power vacuum left by Hoffa's absence was quickly filled by figures less interested in reform and more loyal to organized crime. For many workers, this shift created a sense of betrayal. The man who had once promised to fight for them was gone, and the ones left behind seemed intent on protecting their own interests. The FBI's investigation was hampered by the very culture of silence it was trying to penetrate. The mob operated on loyalty and fear, and breaking through that wall was nearly impossible. Informants hinted at secrets but rarely provided details that could be verified. Every tip led to a dead end. Every lead dissolved into speculation. And yet, the public couldn't look away. The story was captivating because it touched on so many elements of American life. Power, corruption, ambition, betrayal. Hoffa was not just a missing person. He was a character in a larger drama, one that seemed to reflect the uneasy relationship between labor, politics, and organized crime. As weeks turned into months, the coverage shifted from the immediate search to the growing mythology around Hoffa's disappearance. Magazine features explored his rise from a poor kid in Indiana to the head of the most powerful labor union in the country. Television specials dissected his courtroom battles, his time in prison, and his larger-than-life personality. The narrative took on an almost cinematic quality, as if the country were watching the final act of a crime drama unfold in real time. But beneath the spectacle, real people were suffering. Hoffa's family remained trapped in uncertainty. Josephine, his wife, refused to give up hope. She kept the porch light on, a quiet symbol that she believed he would return. His children navigated the painful contradiction of seeing their father both celebrated and vilified in the press. For them, Hoffa was not a headline. He was a father, a husband, a man whose absence left a void that could not be filled. The community's fear also seeped into daily life. Rumors of mob involvement made people wary. Business owners hesitated to speak too freely. Workers worried about what the disappearance meant for the union's future. Some whispered that Hoffa's fate was a message to anyone who dared to challenge the powerful. The FBI knew that public pressure demanded progress. In response, they broadened their search. They dug into fields, drained lakes, and raided suspected mob hangouts. Each search was broadcast by the media, often in dramatic detail. Crowds would gather near sites where agents worked, waiting to see if Hoffa's body would finally be discovered. But every dig ended the same way. Nothing. The empty fields and unturned soil became symbols of frustration. The longer Hoffa remained missing, the more theories multiplied. Some believed he was still alive, hidden away under a false identity. Others believed his disappearance was an elaborate cover-up by the government itself, a way to silence a man who knew too much. Theories spread beyond Detroit, capturing the imagination of people across the globe. By late 1975, the reality was sinking in. Hoffa was not coming back. At least, not in the way his family had hoped. The man who had once commanded the attention of presidents and mob bosses alike had vanished without leaving behind even a footprint. Yet his absence was, in its own way, a presence. Every unanswered question, every rumor, every whispered fear made Hoffa's story larger than life. He was no longer just a labor leader. He was a mystery, a ghost haunting the American consciousness. The fear, the fascination, and the silence would only deepen in the years to come. And with each passing day, the unanswered question grew louder. What really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? As the months stretched into years, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance transformed from an urgent search into a haunting silence. What began as daily headlines slowly shifted into periodic updates, each one filled with the same maddening conclusion. No new evidence, no breakthroughs, no trace of the man who had once commanded national attention. The early frenzy of investigation had given way to frustration. The FBI had poured resources into the case, interviewing hundreds of people, raiding mob hangouts, and even excavating suspected burial sites. Each effort ended the same way, empty-handed. For investigators, it was as if Hoffa had been erased from existence. This lack of progress did not mean the story faded away. On the contrary, the silence itself became part of the mystery. Every time the FBI announced they had come up short, the public fascination only deepened. People were captivated not just by what was known, but by what could not be explained. The silence also allowed myths to grow. Theories about Hoffa's fate spread into American culture like wildfire. Some claimed he had been buried under the end zone of the yet-to-be-built Giants Stadium in New Jersey. Others swore he had been crushed in a car compactor. His remains scattered beyond recognition. A few insisted he was alive, living quietly under a false name, perhaps somewhere far from Detroit. Each theory found its believers, because each explained the unexplainable. Yet behind the myths was a darker truth. Hoffa's disappearance revealed the immense power of silence itself, the silence enforced by fear, loyalty, and the unspoken rules of organized crime. Within mob circles, speaking out was unthinkable. The unwritten code of silence, known as omerta, ensured that even those who knew the truth would never reveal it. For investigators, that silence was more impenetrable than any locked door. The FBI struggled to keep momentum. Agents followed every whisper, every rumor, every tip phoned in by citizens convinced they knew where Hoffa was buried. At one point they tore up farmland. At another they searched beneath garages. Each time television crews gathered, and the nation watched with bated breath. And each time they found nothing. The spectacle of the search became almost as famous as the mystery itself. Meanwhile, the union Hoffa once led was changing. Without him, the Teamsters shifted under new leadership, men whose ties to organized crime were even stronger than Hoffa's had ever been. For many rank-and-file members, this was devastating. Hoffa, for all his flaws, had fought passionately for workers' rights. Those who replaced him seemed more interested in protecting their deals with the mob than fighting for better wages or conditions. Hoffa's absence created a vacuum, one that left many workers feeling abandoned. For the Hoffa family, the silence was personal torment. Josephine, his wife, refused to declare him dead. She held on to hope, believing that one day he might return, or at least that the truth would be uncovered. The light on their porch stayed lit, night after night, year after year. For his children, the uncertainty became part of their lives. They could not mourn properly, nor could they move forward. The man they loved had become a ghost. His fate locked away in secrets no one dared to speak. The FBI formally declared Hoffa legally dead in 1982, 7 years after his disappearance. The decision was necessary for legal purposes, but it felt hollow. Without a body, without answers, the declaration was more symbolic than real. It did little to ease the pain of his family, or to satisfy the public's endless curiosity. During this time, Hoffa's story embedded itself in American culture in a way few disappearances ever had. His name became shorthand for mystery, for something lost without explanation. Comedians joked about him on late-night shows. Movies and novels wove his disappearance into their plots. Theories about where his body might be hidden became a national pastime. But behind the jokes and speculation, there was unease. Hoffa's disappearance was a reminder of the reach of organized crime, and of how even the most powerful figures could be silenced without consequence. It raised questions about corruption, about the intersection of labor unions and the mob, and about the ability of law enforcement to protect those caught in between. The case remained technically open, but in practice, it grew colder with each passing year. FBI agents retired, files gathered dust, and new crimes demanded attention. Yet every so often a new lead would emerge, a mobster's deathbed confession, an informant's rumor, a tip about a hidden grave. Each time the FBI would investigate, and each time, the mystery deepened when no evidence was found. The silence was not just about Hoffa himself. It became symbolic of the unanswered questions of American society in the 1970s. Questions about corruption, about power, about the cost of ambition. Hoffa's disappearance lingered because it was more than a crime. It was a parable. Over time, the memory of Jimmy Hoffa split into two versions. One was the larger-than-life union leader who gave voice to working people. The other was the man entangled with mobsters, blinded by ambition, and undone by his own alliances. His disappearance allowed both versions to exist side by side, without resolution. He became both hero and villain, martyr and cautionary tale. For his supporters, Hoffa's absence was a wound that never healed. For his critics, it was proof of what they had always believed, that deals with dangerous men eventually end in silence. And for the nation as a whole, his vanishing became a reminder that even the most powerful figures can simply disappear, leaving behind only questions. The long silence was not empty. It was filled with speculation, fear, and a kind of cultural fascination that ensured Hoffa's name would never be forgotten. Each decade that passed brought new generations who asked the same question their parents had asked before them. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? And still no one had the answer. But silence does not last forever. Eventually, cracks began to appear. Moments when investigators believed they were close to uncovering the truth, when whispers inside mob circles seemed to hint at mistakes made. The case was far from solved, but it was not entirely frozen. Somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of secrecy, were clues waiting to be uncovered. The question was, would they ever come to light? Years had passed since Jimmy Hoffa vanished, but the mystery refused to stay buried. Every few years, new whispers surfaced, a new lead emerged, and the FBI would once again dust off the files. Each investigation carried the promise of a breakthrough. And though none would provide a definitive answer, they revealed cracks in the silence. Small mistakes, loose ends, and confessions that hinted at the truth. One of the earliest turning points came in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when law enforcement leaned heavily on informants within organized crime. The mob, though disciplined in its silence, was not immune to human weakness. Some men, facing long prison sentences, began to talk in exchange for protection. What they revealed painted a chilling picture of Hoffa's final day. Several accounts suggested that Hoffa was lured to the Machus Red Fox under false pretenses. He believed he was attending a peace meeting with mob-connected union leaders. Instead, the meeting was a setup. According to these whispers, Hoffa was picked up by men he trusted, possibly even allies from within the Teamsters itself. The theory went that he entered a car willingly, not realizing it would be the last ride he ever took. This idea, that Hoffa trusted his killers, was perhaps the most haunting of all. It explained why there were no signs of struggle at the scene. Hoffa was too smart, too cautious to be ambushed by strangers. But trust made him vulnerable. Another thread of investigation focused on the Union Pension Fund. Billions of dollars were tied to loans and investments, many of which were connected to mob-controlled projects, such as casinos in Las Vegas. Hoffa, once out of prison, was determined to regain control of the union, and by extension the pension fund. For mob bosses, this posed an existential threat. If Hoffa returned to power, he could expose deals, cut off funding, or demand conditions that weakened their hold. To them, silencing him may have been a matter of survival. The FBI pieced together these motives but still lacked the one thing that could turn suspicions into a case: a body. Without it, no charges could stick. Over and over, prosecutors prepared to move forward, only to pull back when evidence fell short. Then came the searches, the kind that gripped the public with renewed hope. In 1975, just weeks after Hoffa vanished, investigators dug up a backyard in Detroit based on a tip. Nothing was found. In the 1980s, agents scoured fields, garages, and warehouses. Each search became a spectacle, drawing reporters, television crews, and curious citizens. The FBI even investigated claims that Hoffa was buried beneath concrete at the construction site of Giant Stadium in New Jersey. For years, that rumor became part of American folklore, repeated so often it felt like truth. But no excavation ever uncovered Hoffa. Despite the dead ends, the investigations revealed patterns. Informants consistently pointed to a small circle of mob figures, men like Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone. Both denied involvement until their deaths, but both had the motive, the power, and the history to make them central suspects. In particular, Provenzano, Hoffa's one-time ally turned bitter rival, had allegedly threatened Hoffa in the past. Theirs was not just a professional feud but a personal one, marked by anger and distrust. Over time, more voices emerged. Some mobsters, nearing the ends of their lives, offered hints in interviews or memoirs. They never provided enough detail to solve the case, but they reinforced the belief that Hoffa's disappearance had been a coordinated act, planned carefully, executed quickly, and concealed permanently. The mistakes, if they could be called that, came in the whispers. One story suggested that Hoffa's body had been transported in a truck, then incinerated. Another claimed he had been buried in an unmarked grave near Detroit. Still others insisted he was hidden beneath layers of concrete. The stories conflicted, but they all shared a theme. Hoffa was gone and he would never be found. For the FBI, these contradictions were infuriating. Each new claim required investigation, yet each ended with nothing concrete. But in the process, they built one of the most extensive case files in Bureau history, a labyrinth of interviews, tips, and dead ends. Meanwhile, public fascination never waned. Every time a new lead surfaced, newspapers ran dramatic headlines. Is this the break in the Hoffa case? Television crews followed agents as they dug in fields and searched barns. Even false leads captured imaginations, because each one promised, if only briefly, that the mystery might finally be solved. But the breakthroughs never came. Hoffa's disappearance remained one of the great unsolved puzzles of American life. For the Hoffa family, these cycles of hope and disappointment were especially painful. Each new search raised the possibility of closure, only for it to vanish again. Hoffa's wife Josephine passed away in 1980 without ever learning the truth. His children carried the weight of uncertainty into their own lives, forced to reconcile their father's public image with the private man they had loved. The decades rolled on, and still the rumors multiplied. In the 1990s and early 2000s, journalists revisited the case, unearthing new theories. Books were written, films dramatized the story, and documentaries dissected every angle. Each interpretation brought Hoffa back into the spotlight, reminding the world that the mystery was still unsolved. By the early 21st century, the FBI publicly acknowledged that solving the case was unlikely. Too much time had passed, too many witnesses were gone, and too many leads had already been exhausted. Yet the Bureau kept the file open, unwilling to close the chapter entirely. For law enforcement, as for the public, the Hoffa mystery had become something larger than one man. It was a symbol, a case that stood for all the secrets still buried beneath the surface of American power. In the end, the breakthroughs were not in evidence but in understanding. Hoffa's disappearance taught investigators about the depth of mob influence, about the difficulty of breaking through codes of silence, and about the way myth can sometimes overpower fact. Mistakes had been made, opportunities missed, but the larger truth remained. Hoffa had been silenced, and the silence was unbreakable. And yet, even in that silence, Hoffa's presence endured. His name lived on in union halls, in mob lore, in the headlines of every new theory. Each whisper of a breakthrough kept the story alive, ensuring that Jimmy Hoffa was never truly forgotten. But the story was not just about a disappearance. It was about what came after, the legacy, the lessons, and the way one man's vanishing reshaped the landscape of labor, crime, and American culture. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa left an open wound on American history. It was not just the story of a man who vanished. It was the story of what his absence revealed, the tangled web of labor, politics, organized crime, and the fragility of power. Even without resolution, Hoffa's case became one of the most studied, debated, and mythologized mysteries of the 20th century. By the 1980s and 1990s, the FBI had spent more than a decade chasing shadows. With each failed lead, the Bureau grew more cautious about raising public hopes. They had learned that every excavation, every raid, every new theory brought with it a fresh cycle of headlines, followed by disappointment. Still, the Hoffa file remained open, and agents continued to chase whispers when they emerged. The reality, however, was that most of the men suspected of involvement were now either dead or in prison. Anthony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, both considered central figures in the case, went to their graves denying any role. Other mob leaders who might have known the truth died under their own clouds of suspicion. The silence that had protected Hoffa's killers in 1975 only grew more impenetrable with time. But absence did not equal irrelevance. Hoffa's story lived on because of what it symbolized. In labor circles, he remained a complicated figure, a man who fought fiercely for workers but also entangled the union in relationships that proved dangerous. To many, his disappearance was both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder of the cost of mixing labor rights with organized crime. For the American public, Hoffa became almost legendary. His name entered popular culture in ways few real-life figures ever do. Jokes about "where Hoffa is buried" became a staple of late-night comedy. Movies and novels drew inspiration from his life and his mysterious ending. Even decades later, a simple mention of his name instantly evoked the mystery. Yet the legacy of his disappearance was not just cultural. It had practical consequences. After Hoffa's vanishing, federal authorities intensified their efforts to break the link between organized crime and labor unions. New laws and investigations targeted corruption within the Teamsters and beyond. The government placed the union under federal oversight, a move that would last for decades. In many ways, Hoffa's absence reshaped the future of organized labor as much as his presence once had. For his family, however, the legacy was deeply personal. Hoffa's wife, Josephine, passed without ever knowing what happened to her husband. His children carried the unanswered questions throughout their lives. Some became vocal advocates for uncovering the truth, giving interviews and cooperating with documentaries in the hope of keeping the search alive. Their pain was a reminder that behind the headlines and theories was a family left in limbo. The lack of resolution also had a psychological effect on the nation. Hoffa's disappearance became a kind of collective riddle, an unsolved chapter that fueled both suspicion and fascination. It was not just about crime, it was about trust, power, and the idea that secrets can be buried so deeply they may never surface. The story invited Americans to consider uncomfortable questions. How much influence does organized crime truly have? How far will powerful people go to protect their interests? And what does it say about justice when even the most famous cases remain unsolved? Occasionally, new breakthroughs reignited hope. In 2012, the FBI dug up a driveway in Detroit after a tip suggested Hoffa was buried beneath it. In 2021, another search was conducted under a former landfill in New Jersey. Each time the world watched. Each time nothing was found. These repeated disappointments only cemented the idea that Hoffa's final resting place would never be discovered. And perhaps that was the point. Some investigators came to believe that Hoffa's disappearance had been planned not just as a killing but as a permanent erasure. No body, no evidence, no crime scene, only questions. If true, it was a chillingly effective strategy. It denied Hoffa's family closure, denied investigators resolution, and allowed the myth to grow. But if Hoffa's killers hoped he would be forgotten, they miscalculated. The mystery of his vanishing ensured he would be remembered more vividly than most leaders who simply faded from public life. In death, or in disappearance, Hoffa became immortal. The lessons of the case are complex. On one hand, Hoffa's story is a cautionary tale about ambition, alliances, and the dangers of playing too close to power. His ties to organized crime, whether made out of necessity or opportunism, created enemies who eventually saw him as expendable. On the other hand, his legacy as a fighter for working people remains undeniable. Millions of Americans benefited from the contracts and protections he fought to secure. In this way, Hoffa embodied both the promise and the peril of leadership. For law enforcement, the case remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Despite decades of work, countless hours of investigation, and a file thousands of pages long, the answer to what happened to Jimmy Hoffa remains elusive. It stands as a reminder that even the most powerful institutions cannot always force the truth into the light. For the public, the mystery endures because it taps into something universal: our need for answers. Humans are storytellers by nature, and stories demand conclusions. Hoffa's disappearance denies us that, leaving the ending open and unresolved. It is precisely that lack of closure that keeps the story alive. As the years pass, fewer people remain who remember Hoffa as a living figure. For younger generations, he exists almost entirely as a legend, a name associated with mystery, power, and disappearance. Yet the lessons his story carries remain relevant, about ambition, corruption, loyalty, and the fragility of trust. And so, the legacy of Jimmy Hoffa is not just in what he achieved or in how he vanished. It is in the questions he left behind. Questions about the balance between power and principle, about the cost of silence, and about the ways secrets shape history. In the end, the vanishing of Jimmy Hoffa is not only a story about crime or about one man's fate. It is a story about America itself, its struggles with power, corruption, and justice. A story that began on a summer afternoon in 1975, in the parking lot of a Detroit restaurant, and has never truly ended. Perhaps it never will.